I think it's time to introduce Dr. Miriam Check. And I practice and I'm going to mess it up. Miriam, say your name for us.
Miriam Chaiken.
Chaiken, Dr. Miriam Chaiken, who I am so thrilled to have with us today, because last week we were at Westbeth and we visited at the Westbeth Artists Gallery and got to see their 2022 winter show and talk with some of the artists there. But this is going to really round out that conversation, because Dr. Chaiken has done some incredible research on Westbeth and is ready to talk a little bit with us about it in anticipation for even more coming out in the future. So I'm just really thrilled to welcome you, and I would love for you to talk a little bit about your work, yourself, and your project, and then we'll get into the kind of conversation. So please take it away.
Well, thank you for inviting me this afternoon. I'm coming to you from not New York, but New Mexico. So a different time zone, different climate. I've retired fairly recently from New Mexico State University. And so you might be thinking, what does that have to do with Westbeth in New York? But I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I've spent my whole career doing research in small communities. And until the last few years, most of that was overseas. And then I decided it was time to work closer to home. And I had a lot of connections at Westbeth because 3 of my father's 4 siblings lived at Westbeth for virtually all of their adult life. They were all artists. And so even though I'm far from Westbeth now, I have spent many, many days, many, many months, many, many weeks visiting family and friends at Westbeth over the course of my lifetime. Leanne, you're muted. Sorry.
Yep, no problem. Thanks for letting me know. And so lucky, I think anyone who gets to spend time at Westbeth is very lucky. But then the luck comes to Westbeth and to us that you have this background in anthropology and can do this kind of deep work that's so necessary for this amazing community. So I'll just start kind of at the beginning, and we'll go through this conversation. And please, everyone, if you have questions, put them into the chat, put them into the Q&A. I'll monitor it as we go. If there's something that's relevant to the conversation, I'll edit as we go. And then at about 7, we'll do Q&A with all of you. So hopefully you have some questions, but don't hold them back. Write them in as you go. So in initiating your research, you talked about already your connection to Westbeth. But what was kind of the impetus for this idea specifically, and what you're working on now, and how has that kind of changed as you've been working on it?
Well, right now I'm close to finishing a book manuscript about Westbeth. And I had, all my life, I've worked in rural villages in third world countries, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And about 10 years ago, I reached a point where I thought, field work is just not going to be practical for me anymore. It's physically very demanding. It's very emotionally demanding. And in 2017, a friend of mine and I finished an edited book. And I thought, close that book. I'm kind of done with that chapter of my life, and was sort of thinking about, well, what comes next? And I read the book Hidden Figures about the women mathematicians that made the NASA program so successful in its early years, and these African-American mathematicians who received virtually no recognition for their contributions. And I had the great fortune to meet the author of that book, Margot Lee Shetterly. And the book was just a revelation to me. I thought, she's doing what I've been doing my whole life, and that is working in communities of people who are fascinating, that nobody knows anything about, and who are really important in their own way. And she's giving voice to these people in a sense. And I had done that in my work as an anthropologist, working in small communities, first in the Philippines and later in Africa, with one little sideline trip to Great Britain, where I interviewed very elderly gentlemen who had been in the colonial service in East Africa right after World War II. So that was the only time I actually got to speak my own language in doing my interviews. But I thought to myself, so here's this community of these mathematicians in the Norfolk, Virginia area, and a light bulb went off, and I was like, Westbeth, I've been going to all my life. And it's full of these fascinating people that I had met over the course of my life. And it seemed to me like there were really strong parallels between what Margot had done in her book and what I envisioned being possible. So about 4 years ago, maybe 5 now, I started doing some preliminary interviews with folks at Westbeth to see whether it looked like there was going to be legs to the project. And over the next couple of years, I interviewed close to 100 people who either currently live in Westbeth or did at some point in their life, including some of the younger generation who grew up in the building. And so that's how this project has evolved. And I'll give you a little preview of the title of my manuscript. And this comes from one of the Westbeth residents, Christina Maley. Everybody I interviewed talked about the creative energy of the building, and I'll get into a little bit of that history in a minute, but she said being in this building is like having creative ozone seeping into your body that stimulates creativity. And so the title of the book will be Creative Ozone, the Artists of Westbeth. And that's what I've been working on the last few years.
That's incredible. And Christina, I mean, just so everyone here knows, and we'll share this link with you all as well. We just did a wonderful artist panel at Westbeth last week, and Christina was on it. And that sounds just like something she would say, because just words, like phrases like that just come out of her mouth. And I'll share in the chat a link if anyone's interested. We just launched an oral history of Christina on our oral history archive. So if you'd like to know more about the person who kind of inspired the title of Miriam's book, please check it out. That is so fascinating. And I think the connection to Hidden Figures and the connection that it's someone else's book, but also a movie, and like there's artistry in that connection for the two of you. This is kind of off script, but I want to ask what role does the arts and artistry play in kind of your work in documenting this? Like, is there any connection there with you? I mean, obviously creativity, anything you could kind of put into words, and I know I'm throwing this at you. I'm just so moved by the fact that it was Hidden Figures helped you kind of get to the point where you wanted to think about this work.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I have 0 artistic bones in my body, and so it's very my father had these 3 siblings who were amazingly creative people. His brother Joe Chaiken was a very famous avant-garde theater director, writer, actor. His sister Shami had been a singer. She was the first cantor, one of the first cantors at the Gay and Lesbian Synagogue, CBST, in the West Village. And was also an actress in her brother's open theater company. And then my Aunt Miriam, my Aunt Molly, for whom I am named, and that's a long story. I was a peace offering basically to both sets of grandparents. My Aunt Molly was a writer, and she wrote 37 children's books. So there are these very creative people in our family, but my father was a scientist, and I'm really much more like my father. But I grew up always being exposed to the arts as a child. You know, we went to concerts, we went to every museum you could think of. And my family, I think we considered ourselves appreciators of art rather than artists ourselves. I should take that back. My sister Sarah is a singer. So she got the artistic genes and I got the science genes. So I went off and I've worked as an anthropologist in a very scientific end of anthropology, working in health and nutrition policy and that sort of thing. But my entire life, my closest friends have always been artists, and I don't know why that is so, but it is so. And then I relished my visits to New York to be with my family and to be in part of that Westbeth community, because there's some really interesting people who live in that building. And I can remember visiting my Aunt Shami many, many years ago, and she said, "Oh, we've been invited for cocktails at Barton Bennis's apartment." And she said, "Wait till you see it." And we wandered down the hallway on the same floor as her apartment. And Barton's apartment, the entire apartment was an art installation. He had everything from a life-size stuffed giraffe, like a real giraffe, not like a giant teddy bear toy, a Chinese opium smoking bed, and every square inch of the apartment was covered with works of art, a lot of African masks. And he was a real pioneer in the first generation of artists who were HIV positive and doing their art. And that informed a lot of the art that he did. And so I can remember going to his apartment and he was mixing me a cocktail. And on the table was a cake tray, you know, with a glass dome over it. And it looked like fancy little candies or petit fours that were on this cake tray. And they were the pills that Barton had to take, his antiretroviral pills, to maintain his health. And he had glued them together in little designs like they were little bonbons as one of his art pieces. So, you know, being around people who are creative gives me such pleasure, even though I don't necessarily consider myself a very creative person, although I am a good gardener and I'm a very good cook. So maybe that's my creative outlet. Who knows? Yeah. It's not painting, that's for sure.
That's fascinating, though. I'm getting some feedback. Are you getting some feedback, Miriam?
Sounds fine on my end.
Okay, so we'll just keep going. And someone, this is just too good to pass up. Someone said, did you ever speak to Westbeth's best known actor artist, Vin Diesel? I didn't know Vin Diesel lived at Westbeth at any point, but that was a question from our attendees.
Yes. I tried to reach Mark Sinclair, as he was known when he was growing up in Westbeth, through his people, but his people didn't get back to me. So I'm still hopeful that at some point we can make a connection. But I've talked to many of his contemporaries who have some stories. I have a whole chapter in the book about the kids who are now, of course, now all adults who grew up in the building. And there's some very good Vin Diesel stories, including, it was a rough neighborhood at the time they were living there when they were growing up. And he was kind of the protector of a lot of the younger kids. And they were all like, you know, run on a line with him because then we don't get beat up on the playground.
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. I've already learned something this evening. That's so fascinating. And then most people, I mean, we've already talked a lot about the artists and your connection to the artists, both personal and then through the interviews, but a lot of people write about either individual artists at Westbeth or something. How is your work that you're doing a little bit different from that kind of norm when we get that insight into Westbeth?
Well, there are chapters that deal with the art that people produce from the Westbeth community, but my real focus is on the community itself. I do have one chapter that's really focusing on the history of the building because it has a very interesting and unique history. But my focus as an anthropologist is really telling the stories that people have shared with me, being sort of a conduit for their voices. And my focus is on what is the community about? What are the dynamics in the community? What are some of the challenges that they've faced? What are some of the accomplishments of the community? And so while I've certainly mentioned people's arts and artistic productivity, my focus is on kind of the community as a whole. And one of the themes that I think is extremely important it's like in the DNA of Westbeth is this heavy involvement in every kind of social justice movement that has happened since its inception in 1969. So I write quite a bit about the role of various people in anti-war movements, gay rights movements, Black civil rights movements, you know, especially there was a whole group of cadre of Black actors that were very important in trying to achieve greater equity for African-American performers. My focus is not so much on one individual or just the painters or just the composers, but really on the community as a whole. And as an anthropologist, I'm not looking at it from the point of view of like an art critique or art history. I'm looking at it I'm approaching it ethnographically, and that means the majority of the information that goes into this book is not from published sources, although I read many things. Most of it comes from the stories people shared with me over the hundreds and hundreds of hours of interviews that I've done.
That's incredible. I mean, just the resource of those histories to be able to capture that is huge, and then share it with us in this way. And I would love to get into some of your work now, kind of transitioning into the history of Westbeth. I think a lot of people on this call might know a little bit. I know a little bit, but you obviously know much more than us. And could you talk a little bit about the history and how Westbeth originated? Because we all know it from kind of our entry points from wherever we entered in, but could you tell us about the beginning a little bit?
It's kind of a miracle that Westbeth happened, actually. In the mid-1960s, the philanthropist Jacob Kaplan, who made a lot of money on Welch's grape juice, and his friend Roger Stevens, who was another important person in the arts and who eventually became the first head of the National Endowment for the Arts, they were both committed to trying to support arts and artists in New York City in ways that they could. Kaplan was also very interested in historic preservation, and they got the idea of trying to create an artist community where artists could affordably live and work and focus on being artists and not focus on having to, wait tables or have a day job in order to make a living. So they raised a little bit of money, and they began looking around for properties that could be either developed or rehabbed, refurbished. And they came across the then empty Bell Laboratories, which had been used for almost a century by Bell as their research laboratories and every important technology you can think of, from the microphones, cameras, and computers that we're all using right this very minute, to the transatlantic cable, some of the foundational work for the space program, for our nuclear arsenal, all was developed at the Bell Labs. And so even though parts of the building were very old, built in the mid-1800s, a lot of it was built in the early 20th century. And then as Bell grew and expanded, they needed more space and more modernized space, and they moved out of New York City. So this building was sitting empty. It had been essentially a factory and research lab. The High Line train, we all know the High Line, now the park, the train ran right through the building and was used for loading up things that were made there and taken off to markets around the world. The building was empty, and somehow they thought, oh, this sounds perfect. Now, it's kind of hard to imagine, because at that point in time, there had never been a loft conversion of an industrial building anywhere in the United States. There had never been this kind of scale of project taken on. But they were able to use their seed money and then leverage a mortgage from HUD and purchase the building, but they had a very tiny budget then for the renovation of the building. And if you've ever been in Westbeth, it's sort of more or less a U-shaped building with windows facing, it's bounded on four sides. It's got its name from the two of the streets. It's on the corner of West and Bethune, and on the other side are Washington and Bank. And they were then tasked with taking this giant building that was, a factory, and making it into living space, studio space, performance space, gallery space. And Kaplan's son had been in architecture school, and he said, well, there's a guy I graduated with, and I know he's not working right now, but he did one project. He built a house for his mother. So, that surely qualified him to take on a project of this size. But, you probably could get him to do this design for you. And so they hired a young architect who had no track record whatsoever, named Richard Meyer, who we all now know as one of the most important 20th century architects. And so this was Meyer's first big project. And he had very little money to work with per unit, and he wanted to maximize the space as much as possible. So they purchased the building, and over the late 1960s, the building was renovated, and so they created 383 apartments in the building. Some of them are studios that are just one large room. Some are what are called, they call them the duplexes. They're 2 stories, but they're not 2 stories like you think of a house with 1 story and another story on top of it. These are duplexes where there's 1 story and then there's a very steep staircase, and the 2nd story is on top of the apartment next door or below the apartment next door. So that was a very unusual design. And those are found on floors 3, 6, and 9. And the duplex apartments, another one of Meyer's innovations was the duplex apartments. Because they were on 2 stories, you would enter on 1 story, but there had to be a legal egress on the other story in case of a fire. So he did not like these kind of cage fire escapes that we see on old buildings all over New York City. So he designed these half-moon balconies. So if you were like on the, let's say, the bedroom level of the duplex and the entrance was on the other level, there would be a balcony that would be shaped like a semicircle, connecting your bedroom window or kitchen window, as the case may be, with the person next door. So the idea was, if there was a fire, you step out onto that balcony and you go in through your neighbor's apartment, because the entire building was concrete blocks. So they were pretty sure that if there was a fire in one unit, it would not move to the next one. And in fact, that has proven to be the case, because there have been several fires in its history. The other thing that was really unique about Meyer's design is that HUD would only fund buildings where you could say, you know, how many people could live there and how many bedrooms, basically. Well, this was a giant open space. There were no bedrooms. There were no walls. And so it was through a great deal of pushing and shoving and negotiating that he was able to get his plans approved by taking blueprints for each floor. And imagine like a giant face of a building with, you know, dots of windows all across. He connected a dotted line from each window to the interior hallway, a dotted line to symbolize the equivalent of a room. And so apartments were allocated based on the number of windows they had facing the street. And like 2 windows would be a studio apartment, 3 windows would be considered a 1-bedroom apartment, 4 windows might be a 2-bedroom apartment. But in point of fact, there were no walls. When you went into the apartment, because there was so little money, they had installed a very small kitchen that was, you know, of course, mounted to the wall with cabinets, and a very small bathroom, which had a wall around it. The entire rest of the apartment was open, with the exception of 2 closets that were on casters that could be moved around. And the idea was they would use these to create room dividers as they needed them. And in fact, because the ceilings are so high, some people push the closets together, attach a ladder to it, and have a bed up on top of it to maximize the space in the apartments. So in 1969, the end of 1969, the very first residents moved in. Officially, they opened in 1970. And that's the history of Westbeth in a nutshell. There's lots more stories to be told, but that's the main.
That's the beginning. That is fascinating. And this summer, my husband and I went to Montreal, and there's a big Bell Labs campus on a island out there. And it's just so funny to think, what could that become someday? Like this wonderful Bell Labs space. But I've always, those half-moon balconies are so iconic in terms of when you think about Westbeth and the visuals, that's what you think of. So for it to be so utilitarian, it's so interesting. That's fascinating. And I want to keep going and talk a little bit about preservation and the National Registry status for Westbeth and what is kind of the status of that with the National Registry in Westbeth.
I think I doubt whether there are very many other sites in the country that have the distinction of being twice on the National Register. It has one nomination that was done years ago for its life as the Bell Labs. It's a relatively short document. And then it was nominated a second time and improved a second time in its incarnation as Bell Lab, or as Westbeth. That nomination was written by Andrew Dolkart. It's a fascinating document. He's a professor of architectural history at Columbia, and that's a very extensive document that's both about the history, but also kind of the culture and the people of Westbeth. And included in the document are letters of endorsement or approval from dozens and dozens and dozens of Westbeth's residents who were living there at the time that the nomination was being prepared.
I mean, that makes sense. And we, last week during the panel, we talked a little bit about the fact that people come visit all the time from other cities to say, like, how did this happen? How can we recreate it? There's the artist housing that opened not too long ago on the Upper East Side, where they talked a lot to Westbeth before they launched that. So I imagine this is just another kind of piece. Your work is going to be another piece in that puzzle, hopefully, for this to be replicated and people to see, like, the beautiful success of, and this is me editorializing, the beautiful success of Westbeth. How can we make it happen elsewhere? But I'm sure it's changed over the years, and depending on when you lived there, you probably have a very different experience of Westbeth. And then we're very lucky to have some artists who've been there from the beginning. Could you talk a little bit from your research how Westbeth has changed and how that might have either been in response to or similar to changes in the neighborhood over the years?
That's a good question, because the changes have been vast. So, first of all, it was an industrial building. It was never intended to be having anybody living there, certainly not children living in the building. And at the time people moved in 1970, the West Side Highway there was no park along the Hudson River as there is now. There were piers that were very much still in use. A few cruise ships docked there, but it was often used for barges for offloading and loading and offloading, including all of New York City's garbage right at the edge of near where Westbeth is located. The West Side Highway was not at street level as it is now. It was an elevated highway, and it was this giant metal monstrosity that kind of blocked the second and third floor windows on the west side of the building. There were no street lights in the neighborhood. It was very dark. It was very grungy. It was pretty dangerous. The meatpacking district was meatpacking. I mean, there was a little diner across the street from Westbeth. And when people would stop in for their morning coffee, the butchers who had been on duty since 4 in the morning were coming in with blood-stained aprons to get a sandwich for lunch. The area was kind of famous for a lot of New York's underworld in those days. There were eventually a number of leather bars established in the area, some of which were run by the mafia. There were transgender and gay prostitutes, sex workers working along the piers at nighttime underneath the highway, and a lot of drug dealing in the neighborhood. So it was a very gritty, in some cases dangerous neighborhood. In the early days, there was a lot of concern about security. So among other things, people carried whistles with them. And if they were worried or felt they were in any danger, they would start blowing the whistle. And in a number of cases, people told me stories of, hearing a sex worker who was being beaten up or abused, and they'd start blowing their whistles to bring help to help this person and protect this person. So it was a very, very different physical setting than it is now. I mean, now it is one of the most expensive zip codes in all of the United States. And people see these shiny buildings and, everybody who has tons of money with, Palazzo Chupi, Julian Schnabel's pink monument a block or so over it's just kind of hard to imagine what Westbeth was like in those days. It was a very, very different place, and the neighborhood was a very, very different place. Having said that, all of the residents that I talked to at Westbeth love the park along the river. They love the fact that they can actually get some groceries in the neighborhood, and they didn't have to go, 30 blocks to find groceries. But they all kind of miss those gritty days.
That's so interesting. And it's interesting that children keep coming up in all of these conversations, because I think in terms of artist housing, it's so unique that there was the idea that families could live there. It's not, I'm starting my career, give me a studio and I'll be fine. The thought was actually living in this space. I mean, is there anything in your research or in the beginning or over time, how that kind of component of family living kind of impacted either the development or the lives of those artists?
When they moved in, you have to remember, this is 1969, 1970, and the Vietnam War was at its height. And some of the people who moved in that early generation intentionally had children so that the men had a lower risk of being drafted and being sent to Vietnam. So a lot of families started very quickly, or in many cases, some cases they moved in with, tiny babies. And a lot of pets. I mean, a lot of pets got moved into Westbeth too. People don't think of New York as being like pet centric, but there were all manner of things, including very, very briefly, a horse living in an apartment that rode the elevators to go for a walk outside. They had to put a stop to that. That was obviously not a good plan. Horses don't do well in high-rise buildings. But a lot of people either came in and with partners or partnered thereafter, or often in many cases unpartnered and repartnered, which happened a lot in the early years of Westbeth. But a lot of kids were born, and there's a whole generation of artists, some of whom are now second generation artists within Westbeth, who in many cases went away and came back as a second generation Westbeth resident as an artist in their own right. Others went on to be artists who maybe no longer live in Westbeth, but maybe have parents who still live there or family members who still live there. And in the early years, there were a lot of events that were centered around, providing a life for the children. They had, the kids built skateboard ramps in the courtyard of Westbeth. The basement, which is this dank, dangerous, scary place, was like the children's playground. One person used this phrase, but many of them describe this in the same way. They say we were feral children. And in some ways, it was the 70s. If things were more relaxed, perhaps. Child rearing was not as buttoned up and programmed as maybe it is now. But it wasn't uncommon for Westbeth kids to just sort of leave their apartment first thing on Saturday morning and be playing with each other all weekend long. And they were playing in the basement in very dangerous places. They would have these games of hide and seek that would last like 48 hours. And kids would like wedge themselves in behind boilers in the basement, and it would take hours before someone would find them. They were playing on the roof of the building, which is extremely dangerous. The idea of having, 7-year-olds running loose on a 13th floor or 11th floor roof is kind of terrifying for most of us to think about. And in fact, there was one, amazingly near tragedy. One girl, Grace, there were still smokestacks coming up through part of the building, and she climbed the ladder on the outside of the smokestack and fell through the smokestack into basically the basement of the building. And the fire department was called, and they were sure they were going to find her body. But because no one had ever cleaned out the smokestack, it had 100 years of soot in it. And she landed on something like 8 feet deep of soot, and it cushioned the blow enough that she broke a few bones but survived the fall. So the stories of the people who grew up there, it was both a magical place, and it's amazing that more of them didn't have. There was another boy who was killed in an accident, not at Westbeth, but he was playing in a construction site nearby and was tragically killed. But the kids there grew up with a great sense of both taking care of each other and also a sense of autonomy that I think would have been pretty rare for most children growing up. The one time when there was a little bit of I guess I would say reining in and a little bit more like parents walking children to school was when a little boy named Etan Patz was kidnapped and disappeared off the streets, and his body was not found until decades later. But when he disappeared, suddenly all the adults were, their radar went up, like, we have to be paying more attention to what's happened to our children. But it was kind of a magical place for kids to grow up.
That's fascinating, and also so interesting. I find Westbeth's history both aligning with New York City history, but also having different moments. And that's a moment where it's very aligned, because I think that kidnapping really hit New York across the board. So that's very interesting. And it leads me to the question, this group of individual artists coming together, how did it become like a community? And could you talk a little bit more about that? And rather than just being neighbors, did you find any large apartments in the building? How, and you spoke about like people living on the same floor going for cocktails, and you walk in and it's all of a sudden an artist installation. I'm very interested in this like community of artists and how this all kind of built on each other.
Well, it's interesting because I think Westbeth came into being at a time when there was like this huge push in our country for collective action for social justice. At the same time, you have nearly 400 artists, and by their very nature, as one of the people I interviewed said, well, by their nature, artists have to have a little bit of an ego, and they have to be a little bit of an individualist in order to just, survive as an artist. So there were these two conflicting forces of coalescing and individualism. A number of the artists do arts that require collaboration. I mean, you can be a writer and you can sit with your pen in a dark room and not talk to anybody for a year. But if you're a musician, you have to play in ensembles. And if you're doing large sculptures, you can't physically do the construction yourself. So some genres of artists kind of naturally coalesced and worked together. But I think that the major force was kind of this social justice thrust through the DNA of the people at Westbeth. There was always a sense that they had to do the right thing. And sometimes doing the right thing was like, okay, we're in opposition to some other force outside. And that force was often the management of one sort or another. In the early years, the Westbeth Corporation, which had to pay a mortgage to HUD, had to raise rent several years in a row. And so the tenants rebelled against this and started a rent strike in 1972 that was eventually resolved. But that was kind of the first collective action of the community saying, no, we won't put up with this. In later years, there were different building managers, some of whom were really wonderful and some of whom were really despised by the residents, who felt like they were treated like they were just tenants. They were not special, they were not artists. And also the board of directors of the Westbeth Corporation, at various times, they were either highly supportive of the actions of the artists or viewed them as, kind of a nuisance when they were really trying to think about real estate deals. So at various times, things have happened in the history of the community that have made the artists coalesce around some issue that they feel was very, very important. In the recent years, some of that coalescence has focused on caring for the very elderly in the building. And organizations like the Westbeth Artists Resource Council, Westbeth Artists Residence Council, WARC, has focused on, really creating safety nets for those that are have been in Westbeth for 50 years and are now very, very elderly, and in some cases very frail people. But that sort of collective action, I think, has been part of the ethos of the community for a long time.
Yes, and Christina mentioned they have artists in residence. I forget if she said it was 3 or what the exact number was, where they have a few homes set aside for people from other countries.
Yes.
Who might not be able to practice their art with freedom, so then they can come to Westbeth, yes. Which is just a beautiful reminder of both what we have here and also what the artists are fighting for.
I think in recent years, we've seen Westbeth really try to focus on being more outward looking, of like, you know, we are this island of artists, but we're also this island of calm and safety. And they've wanted to extend that to some people from countries. I mean, I know they've had artists from Iran and Congo, parts of Caribbean, artists who are living in very dangerous places, where either just the physical space is dangerous or the kind of art they do makes them vulnerable. And so this has been really an amazing program where they've hosted, I think, several dozen people now for various durations to do their art. Yeah,
such an embodiment of all that you're saying programmatically. So I'd love to know some of the most, I mean, you can also give us some names of people we might recognize, but that may be the same or may be different from some of your most interesting conversations. I'd love to hear some stories of interesting conversations, and please everyone start putting your questions in, because we'll transition to that in a little bit, but we would love to hear some of your interesting stories from your interview.
Oh, there is not an uninteresting person in the entire building. I can say that. Some of them are more talkative than others, but they're all fascinating people. Bob Gruen was just an amazing person to talk to. He is the quintessential rock and roll photographer, and every important musician from the 1960s through to today has been photographed by Bob. And his stories of, you know, traveling with these various bands and being part of you know, really getting a start with the Ike and Tina Turner Review. The very famous portrait of John Lennon, where he's standing with his arms crossed and he's got the sleeves off his shirt and it says New York, that was Bob's photograph. So interviewing Bob and hearing about his life experiences was fascinating. Ken Wade is a painter, but who was also this amazing musician. And he was telling me about leaving the service during the Vietnam era when he was a conscientious objector, and he hitchhiked across the country carrying 2 guitars and decided he needed to leave the United States because of his opposition to the Vietnam War. And he arrived at the port in, I think it was Houston, trying to get a ride on a freighter going anywhere, and was carrying 2 guitar cases. And the ship that he approached, they said, "Why do you need 2 guitars?" And he said, "Well, one is for classical music and one is for popular music." And the captain said, "Do you know how to play Beethoven?" And he said, "I know how to play Beethoven. Come aboard." So he got his ride, you know, his ride across to Australia by playing music for the captain. You know, and there are other people. I mean, Barton Bennis, whose apartment I've told you all about. People who have done amazing things. You know, many of them, their apartment is in and of itself a work of art. I've just met many fascinating people. It's been a real privilege for me to be able to spend time with all of these folks.
Of course, and a privilege that we get to reap the benefits of having that history, you know, preserved and shared. That's an enormous, because you were right, it could have been hidden and could have gone on without us having this documentation. Right. And that there's a few questions that are coming in that makes me want to ask. what, from your research, how do people become artists who get to live there? And has that changed over time? Like, we talked about the first generation coming in, and there's a couple questions coming in about the future generations that came in. Could you speak a little bit about how people become part of the community?
Yes. In the process has changed a little bit, but the principles are basically the same. And that is that the artist has to qualify both in terms of income eligibility, meaning, you know, if you're Picasso, you are earning too much money and you can't be part of the Westbeth community. You have to earn 50% of your income from doing your arts. So, you know, you have to be working full-time as an artist. And you also have to have letters of recommendation from other artists in your genre. So, you know, painters would need letters from other painters, dancers from dancers, and so on. In the first years when they were first trying to fill up Westbeth, Jacob Kaplan's daughter, Joan Kaplan Davidson, who has remained very involved in the life of Westbeth through her many decades, she formed a committee of representatives from the major museums and arts institutions in the city of New York, and they were the ones that screened the first generation of artists who moved in. So you had to have 3 letters of recommendation from somebody who knew about your artwork. So I remember Penny Lane telling me that who was a puppeteer, she had the famous puppeteer Bob Baird wrote her one of her letters. Joan Hall, who was a visual artist, could only find 2 letters. So she got a canvas and painted on it, "Joan Hall has inspired much of my work," and signed it Picasso and presented that as her 3rd letter of reference, which apparently they thought it was clever enough that she got in. And then once the building was full, there was a wait list so that as units became available, people on the wait list would have a chance to get in. Well, as you might imagine, when it was first envisioned, Jacob Kaplan imagined this as a place like, oh, an artist is going to move in, they're going to stay for 5 years, then they're going to be rich and famous and they'll move on. Well, of course, you know, that was not realistic in terms of the arc of anyone's career or the real estate market in New York or anything else. So many, many people stayed much longer. So units did not turn over very quickly. And after many years, my sister, who was a singer, and she'd gone to Juilliard and she was singing in New York, she put her name on the list. This would have been probably the late 1980s, maybe. And in 20 years, never heard anything. You know, so people were on the list for decades. And some of the people interviewed who moved in the 80s or 90s were on the list for 12, 14, 16, 20 years before they got an apartment. So after many, many years, they just threw out the old waiting list because, you know, people had been on the waiting list for decades. And then about 3, maybe 4 years ago, they decided they needed to start a new list as apartments came open. They opened the waiting list, the application list, for I think 4 weeks or 6 weeks, and they have had 1,000 applications. So obviously the need for affordable housing is still very much there in the New York arts community. And they still have a similar process where they have to establish income eligibility and then be vetted as artists before they're allowed to move into one of the new places.
Wow. So yes, one of the artists on the panel last week said he was on the wait list for over 10 years. And he said, but you got to get on the wait list if you're ever going to get in. So that was kind of his take on it. We're getting a few questions in, and I'm going to want to turn over to your questions all very soon. But I have one last one for you. What is kind of the status of your project? You mentioned the manuscript. Where are you going from here? Anything else you'd like to share before we get into the audience questions?
I've written all but 1 chapter of the book, and I'm now working on securing publication options. So that's my major focus at the moment. And I have a couple of encouraging pieces. I've had some encouraging communications recently. So I'm crossing my fingers. Early in the new year, my focus will be for the first few weeks, I need to work on illustrations. So if anyone is connected to Westbeth and has, photos from 1980s, 1990s, I'd love to hear from you, because I'm trying to secure photographs that will align with the themes of each chapter of the book. So I think, realistically, I could have a completed manuscript by this spring, and hopefully have a publisher who's interested in making this up into a book. That's my hope.
Wonderful. Well, we can't wait, and we can't wait to have you back to celebrate the launch of the book, because this is just so vital, so aligned with what we do at Village Preservation, but also just so vital to the community, and both the community of arts in New York City, and also the community specifically of the West Village that we represent. So keep those questions coming in. I do have a couple that I would love to get to. Someone asked, can you say something about the Halloween parade and how it originated at Westbeth?
Yes, that's a fascinating topic. Speaking of photographs, that's one of the areas where I really want to secure photos from the early days. So the whole idea for the Halloween parade was started by Ralph Lee, who is a puppeteer and actor who still lives in Westbeth. He's an amazing person. His entire apartment is his studio. For those who are my generation, Ralph is the guy who created and when I say puppet, most people think of puppet. Ralph's are puppets. They're like things you inhabit, and they are twice your size, and you have arms that are reaching out. They're huge things in many cases. But Ralph is perhaps most famous for Land Shark from Saturday Night Live. Leanne, you're too young to know what that's about, but he was the one who created the Land Shark puppet. So he came up with the idea for the Halloween parade. And in most parades, you sit still and the parade walks by you. And the Halloween parade started in the courtyard at Westbeth, and it started with 8 to 10 feet long, wide spiders rappelling down the side of the building from the roof. And there were, on one year, his son rappelled down the side of the building wearing some fabulous costume. And then everybody gathers in the courtyard, everybody in costume, and then they march. They become the parade. And as they go along the parade route, on somebody's balcony or on the stoop of another building, there's some vignette of scary Halloween things. So a friend of mine, Nancy Gabor, who's an actor, said that she was ahead of the witches one year, and they would march down the block, and at the end of the block there'd be this group of witches who'd be doing some little enactment that would scare the children, and then they would end up they would often go out of the courtyard down Bank. They would turn onto Washington, then they would turn on Bethune and march towards Bleecker and Abingdon Park, Abingdon Square. And all along that whole route, there would be tableaus of various events that would be entertaining those that were walking along the parade route. Eventually it became bigger, and then it became the Greenwich Village Halloween Parade. And by the mid to late 1970s, no, I think Ralph stayed with it for a number of years as kind of the head of the parade, but eventually it was taken over, I guess, by Greenwich Village. But it had its first incarnation at Westbeth, and everybody who ever attended one of the parades, it was like they all became children again when they talked about the Halloween parade, how magical it was.
That's incredible. And so incredible to think the stories of parades in New York, like the Macy's parade started by immigrants who wanted to have their celebrations in the street, like at home. This parade started by a community of artists, just like these huge things that are now on television and get sponsors and things. To think of it really started with community and with what you study and share. That's fascinating. And inspiring to me. It gives me hope in these times. Someone had a great question early on. So any history of Westbeth when scientists were there? I'm guessing once it became Westbeth versus Bell Labs, from the question.
The scientists were part of the Bell Lab era, and I'm trying to think if there's anybody. Well, actually, Hugh Seidman, who's a really marvelous poet and is known for a poet, was originally an engineer by training, and so he continued writing as his side job. He wrote scientific manuals in addition to his poetry when he stopped being an engineer. So there's still a little bit of a science connection there, but the scientists were primarily from the Bell Lab era. But every important scientist of the last 100 years, including Turing, including Einstein, were at least briefly at the Bell Labs.
Wow.
So some, heavy hitters, big names.
Heavy hitters for sure. And then I don't know how much information you have about this, but a follow-up to that was, were there a lot of women scientists at Bell Labs during the war? Relating back to your hidden figures comment. But
that's a really interesting question. Next book, maybe. I don't know. I haven't looked into that at all. Very
interesting. Very interesting. And we have a great question from Christina, who your ears must have been burning this whole time, Christina. And she thanked us, but also said, is there a difference between artists community and, let's say, regular communities of people who live adjacently? Like, in your research, have you seen any kind of similarities or differences when it comes to either specifically Westbeth or other research you've done?
Well, the idea for the book came as I started doing the interviews. I realized this is just like an African village. It's just a vertical version of an African village where, for better or worse, everybody knows everybody's business, but everybody takes care of each other too. My Aunt Shami, who died in just as the pandemic was setting in March 2020, she always thought New York was the center of the world, and that, why would anybody want to live anywhere else? And I would say to her, when was the last time you crossed 14th Street? Oh, it's been years. When was the last time you were in Brooklyn? Oh, I haven't been in Brooklyn in decades. Because they were this like self-contained village. They, other than walking down the street to get groceries, or, maybe going to a bar around the corner or going somewhere to have a meal, they had everything they needed at Westbeth. And so they were very much, one might say insular, but one might also say protected community in and of themselves. And so even though they're embedded in one of the largest cities in North America, they were also kind of inward looking and functioned as a community, just that building, that one square block. And I think that's different than, let's say, an apartment building, a large apartment building that occupies one square block, when you don't have that same kind of interdependence and support for each other, and inevitably both collaborations and factions as well. I think that's one way, in one way that particular building is very unique in New York.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting, some of the artists last week talked about a common purpose of everyone's getting up and going to work, and the work is art, and yes,
and that was that was an important thing that people said, is that I never had to explain to anybody why I did what I did. I never had to justify myself as an artist. I never had to explain what my day job was. Everybody was making art, and everybody knew that was what motivated them. It wasn't like, oh, I have to go make art again today. This was just like something that wells up within them. They have to be creative. And, I think that kind of passion is what motivated people. I mean, there are people in Westbeth who were making art in their 90s and maybe even over 100 in Edith Stefan's case. So it's not like they're like, oh, I'm 65, I'm going to retire now. and I'm done with what I've spent my life doing. They will keep doing their art until they can't physically do anything anymore.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I shared at the panel that when I was the chair of the Dance NYC Junior Committee, we literally would go through role plays to have people be confident to be able to say, I am an artist. That is my job, you know, and would have different ways. And so the thought of a community where you don't have to do that is a huge, like people might not realize, but it's a huge relief to not have to justify your kind of existence every day to your neighbors even.
Well, and on that same note, I remember Bob Bruin said to me that when he got accepted at Westbeth, he said, okay, they recognize me. I am an artist. Yeah, the government recognizes that I'm an artist. And, you know, that was very important to a lot of people in feeling like they belonged.
Yeah. And I would connect that currently to those artist grants. I don't know if you've heard about these, Miriam, out there, but there was a whole bunch of artist grants that went out just to support artists doing art in New York City post-pandemic. And so I could imagine a very similar feeling if you receive a grant to do your art from the government. Now you can say you're an artist. So all different ways that I see Westbeth's kind of ethos reflected through the current things, and that it is still current, and we're not talking in past tense solely of Westbeth is also a huge accomplishment, I feel.
Well, it's like the WPA artists during the Depression, where the government giving money to make artists create art, and think of some of the magnificent things that were created during that generation. Thank goodness for it. Yeah.
I mean, Rockefeller Center has that huge mural that we would not have in our city if not for that. Another question someone asked, as Westbeth's second generation of residents moved in, did anything change about the community? Was there kind of a second generation kind of wave or something?
I think there's maybe a little less togetherness of the younger generation with each other compared to the first generation. But by the same token, I know all of the younger people that I interviewed talked with great reverence about those that came before them and how important their contributions were. You know, just making a living has gotten harder for everybody in every field. I think today, making a living for folks is a lot more challenging. And maybe we feel like we have to have more to be comfortable. I'm not quite sure. So I think that there have been more financial pressures on sort of the younger generation to be able to make a living and still pay their rent and, you know, be able to send their kids to school and that sort of thing. But the people who live there are still, you know, they're still working artists, and they're still very engaged and very active. And, you know, the pandemic didn't stop them from doing that. In fact, in a few cases, like photographer David Plocky, if you go on his website, he has some amazing photographs that he took during the pandemic of the empty New York City. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at his website. It's David Plake, and he has some amazing photographs, including of a friend of his who was a dancer, who was dressed in these flowy garments, dancing in the middle of completely empty streets.
I'm so glad someone captured that, because it was a very surreal, and I will put the link in the website or in our chat. It was such a surreal time in New York. And so for an artist, such a stellar artist, to be able to capture those things is, I think, an important part of what happened here. Let's see. I'm trying to find
the National Art. I know the National Archives actually had an interesting project and they contacted photographers all over the nation to collect photographs, to have an archival document about the country during the pandemic. And the only reason I know that is my husband is a photographer, and he had pictures that he'd taken here in New Mexico. And he was invited to submit those to a collection, their collection. And he had pictures of, we live at the edge of this little village called Mesilla, which is a 100-year-old, very Mexican village. And he had photographs of people having mass in the plaza outside the church because it wasn't safe to be in the church, of people kneeling in the plaza. And so his photographs are now part of that collection.
That's amazing. I'm so glad that some things we're doing right as a society. A couple of other questions. How variable are the rents? Are they part of rent stabilization, rent control?
I know they're rent stabilized. I don't know the ins and outs of, I know in the old days you had to turn in your income tax returns every year and they would establish your monthly rent on the basis of what you earned the year before. So some people were paying very little. They're all, I mean, I think it's safe to say they're all well below what you would have to pay for fair market value rents in New York City today, which is part of why it's so attractive. But I don't know the ins and outs of the pricing structure.
Yeah. And then someone asked, what about the older jazz musicians at Westbeth? Question mark. That's all that was asked. But do you have anything to share about the jazz legacy at Westbeth?
I did not interview any of the jazz musicians. The one person I was scheduled to interview was not jazz per se. I think it falls under the world music umbrella, was Madeline Yayadele Nelson, who started the Women of the Calabash group. And it was, reclaiming African music and Caribbean music. And sadly, she passed away before I was able to interview her. So that one didn't happen. But there were some very famous jazz musicians who, of an earlier generation, who are no longer living, like Freddie Waits, who was a Westbeth resident. There were some Gil, I'm blanking on his name. I can send that to you later. But there were a number of very important jazz musicians who lived in Westbeth, and some of them there are some jazz musicians and other kinds of musicians still living there. Paul Collins is kind of a rock and roller, but he's a terrific musician, and he does a lot of songwriting, and I really like his music. And
Gil Evans, is that who you
Gil
were
Evans, that's it. Yeah, that was the name.
Yeah.
I was trying to think of it. Yeah.
Yes, he has a profile on Westbeth's website. So
yeah.
Just, I mean, the history there could take us eons to go through. But Dr. Chaiken, thank you so much for joining us today. I am very excited about the book. I hope everyone else is too. Good luck with those final stages of that, which can be a lot of work. But I think we're waiting with bated breath. And who knows, if you're in town, maybe we can do something at Westbeth. That would be very cool.
I will certainly be in New York on a regular basis for the foreseeable future. So I would look forward to that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it would be great to see you in person. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to everyone who makes Westbeth what it is, including Dr. Chaiken, your work, so that we can continue, hopefully, to remember the history and make more history in the village with this wonderful place. Anything else you'd like to say as we close things out?
No, I mean, just again, an appeal. If there's anybody who's in the audience who is part of the Westbeth community, who has photographs that you think would be interesting for me to see, I would love to hear from you. And Christina or George Kaminsky would be able to give you my email address so we can be in touch.
Yeah, and you can also, you all are getting an email from me in response, so I'm happy to pass anything on.
Oh, she can pass on my email. That would be great.
Yeah, I can connect folks too. So feel free, if you are a resident artist or someone who has great photos from Westbeth, reach out, just respond to the email you get from me and we'll get you in touch. So thank you all for joining us this evening. We're looking forward to more celebration of this wonderful space and also your work. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. It was really a pleasure, and I hope to see you all in the future and in person.